assuming that we'll use the time. I thought we had a pretty good start on this. The first affirmative has a very clear structure that's easy to follow. There's excellent evidence that's being utilized to support the points. I got a very good outline of what it is that we're going to be talking about. So everything is set up pretty well. On the negative responses, it didn't seem like there's really much attempt to address the harm issue that the affirmative is talking about. Gesundheit. The best argument that you have is that these harms are likely to occur from the glitz pageants rather than just from the natural pageants. And neither side, I think, is very clear as to how many people are participating in which kind of pageant. And that would be one of those things that I think you could maybe, if there was some evidence to suggest that the vast majority of the pageants that are involved are these other kinds of pageants, and that what they're talking about is something exceptionally, narrow, that I think that would help your argument a lot more. And then, of the 500,000 people who, I forget, there was a number thrown around somewhere. How many kids participate?
6 to 16, 3 million.
6 months to 16.
Oh, 6, that's
3 million in the 6 months to 16-year-old category.
Yeah, but they said attracted, so I don't
Yeah. Well, let's say it's 3 million people, but if it's only 200,000 who participate in the glitz pageants, that's a lot smaller number, and all of a sudden the source of the problem is really less likely to be as significant as the affirmatives talk about. I don't know what kind of numbers there are on this. I haven't done any research on it. I'm just telling you how you might go about trying to reduce that significance a little bit. The other thing that I think you need to do is challenge them a little bit more on the statistical relationship here. They've got some good examples of people who report self-loathing and problems later on. They've got a couple of psychologists who have opinions about these kinds of things. Their statistical data is a little thin. Now, there is a piece of evidence that comes up in the rebuttals that talks about I think it was a percentage who have negative body image when they are older as a result of participating in the pageants. I don't remember what the percentage was. Do you remember, was there a percentage in it?
It was by Martina Cartwright, but no, she was a study conducted in 2005. I couldn't find the percentage.
But there was no percentage stated.
No.
Okay,
But
so
it was by the same person who they
yeah,
were.
no, but so I mean, I think that's the press that you make on this, and you say, look, there's no doubt that some people are affected by these kinds of things, but the truth of the matter is it's hard to tell what's going to affect which people, and it definitely seems unreasonable to try and impose a rule or a standard, or in this particular case a ban below the age of 12 on folks when we don't even know how many of them have these problems or how likely it is that they have these problems. This is for lack of a better way of putting it, I think you ought to come out and say, look, we've got a bunch of do-gooders who are all kind of paranoid because kids are dressing up like adults and it's freaking them out. Well, I understand why they are freaked out, but there's no evidence that says anybody's harmed by the kids dressing up like adults. There's an example that gets used in the debate, for instance, where they mention the one kid who pretends to smoke on stage using a candy cigarette. Like, that is the most horrible thing in the world. And I'm going, okay, so what's bad about that? Why is that a horrible thing? How does that hurt anybody? And there's not really much there. We just kind of have this negative impression that's being given here. And I think you guys need to press that kind of thing a little bit more because they've got a good general argument about these issues, but I'm not sure that they're good follow-up statistics on it, So, and I think you could push a little bit hard on that. You let that go for the most part. I did like the two ideas of the strategies that you had to try and say, look, the real source of the problem is not the all of the pageants; it's just these glitz pageants. And the other thing is that there is a lot of value in the pageants that the kids are going to get too, and we have to weigh that value against these other kinds of things. So if they start early and they gain poise, they get all these kinds of things, they start earning scholarships, they learn how to compete, and we can see positive outcomes. I mean, let's face it, if they've got negative examples, you've got a whole bunch of positive examples. So here we are contrasting the sets of examples. You ought to be getting more out of those positive examples. I think also the negative needs to divide up their responsibilities a little bit differently, because it really sounded like Robert's got 2 disadvantages or 3 disadvantages that he's presenting in the first negative, and that you kind of repeat 1 or 2 of those disadvantages when we get to it. And you've got some other arguments to say. I think the better idea for the negative would be to argue, look, there's the general philosophy that you've got there. I think that's a good position for the first negative, that this is not something that rises to the level of government regulation. People are entitled to engage in this sort of thing. This is a decision for parents to make, and we ought to make sure that parents are educated, and we ought to try and drive people into the more naturalistic pageants so that the competition is healthier. And we should watch this kind of stuff, but the truth is it doesn't really rise to the level of something that we ought to be regulating by the government here. That's our philosophy on this. So let's minimize it and point out what our perspective is. And then the second negative could say much more clearly, there's a big cost to getting rid of this. You could argue disadvantages about people being employed, and argue the loss of scholarships, and the women being developed into more productive people as a consequence. They learn leadership skills and all those kinds of things. I think those are the disadvantages that you have there, and then you've got a good counter significance to them. So your issue is that it's a little bit more. It needs to be organized a little bit differently, and you need to kind of pick how you're going to develop those arguments more. And like I said, and then press more on the significance issue. I have less to say about the affirmative because I thought they did a better job on a lot of those kinds of things. You guys, when Christina comes back, she attempts to follow the arguments that you're presenting. It did sometimes sound like I've got a response plan and that's the response I'm going to make. I sometimes think you need to be a little bit more creative and explain those responses too. But there's always a response to an argument, and there's usually good information there too. So you need to be able to tell us why the arguments are important. But otherwise, structurally, I thought everything was right, and you guys did pretty much what the affirmative side in the debate's supposed to do. Like I said, I think it's a little bit weak on the significance issue. You lay out what the significance claims are. Proving that it's that harmful is probably just hard to do at this point, and that's it's kind of speculative at that point. And then in the rebuttals, I thought people did a pretty good job trying to pick issues that they thought were important to talk about and find the right things to do. I think both sides could do a little bit clearer job summarizing the whole thing. Although Christine, I thought you did a pretty good job there at the end, kind of making the point that look, we know we've got this issue. The parents are not being responsible. It could have these long-term harms. There's not really any reason. There was one thing that I thought was a little fishy about we got a whole new significance claim in the second affirmative rebuttal after the negative is not going to be able to respond to it. Suddenly, these kids are now being poisoned by hairspray that is going to disrupt their hormones and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going, you don't get a chance to ever respond to that. So that's a new significance claim in the rebuttal. That's one of those things that you're really not supposed to do. So if I was looking at this, I'd say it's a little late to be introducing that in the argument. Okay, thank you guys for your patience.